So the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, just came out on March 22nd, March 23rd, just a couple weeks ago. These are the criteria for hoarding disorder in the DSM. The first is persistent difficulty discarding or parting with possessions regardless of their actual value. Used to be the case. In the old DSM, hoarding showed up in one of the other disorders, and there it was defined as the inability to throw out worthless or worn out things. Well, we know that's not true. We know it's that people with hoarding save everything. They don't just save things that are worthless and worn out. So that's why this phrase was added, regardless of their actual value. The second criteria, this difficulty discarding is due to a perceived need to save the items and distress associated with discarding them. There are instances of people whose homes look like a home that's hoarded, but they've got no interest in the objects in the home. In that case, it's not hoarding. It's usually another disorder. The symptoms result in accumulation of possessions that congest and clutter active living areas of the home and substantially compromise their intended use. There are a couple of important things here. First of all, it's active living areas of the home we're concerned with. We don't care if the attic's full. We don't care if even if the garage is full. Storage units, the active living area is what compromises the person's life, and that's the key to the diagnosis. If the active living area, a part of the living area is okay, then a diagnosis is unlikely, except under one circumstance. And that circumstance is if there's someone else who's controlling the space, a spouse, some authority, and so forth, that's clearing out the space, and the person, and what we will see in that context is conflict between the parties involved. Finally, the hoarding causes clinically significant stress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. I won't go into too much detail here, but there are issues related to safety, there are issues related to health, and to the ability to function in the home, to be able to do the activities of daily living that are associated with normal living in the home. Now, there are a couple of exclusion criteria. So hoarding is not attributable to another, if it's caused by another medical condition. And there are some medical conditions that result in hoarding. For instance, certain kinds of brain injury and cerebrovascular disease can lead to hoarding behavior. In those cases, they would not be considered hoarding disorder. Also, there's a genetic disorder called Prader-Willi Syndrome that is associated with hoarding behavior. Prader-Willi Syndrome, for those of you who may not have heard of it, is a genetic disorder where there is a problem with the ability to detect satiety. And the children with this disorder get grossly obese because they can't recognize when they've eaten, when they're satisfied, when they're sated. Now, and associated with that is often hoarding behavior. And it's not just hoarding of food, but hoarding of other things as well. Finally, the hoarding is not better accounted for by symptoms of another DSM-5 disorder. Here, most often, it's OCD. Now, this is where it gets a little bit complicated because it used to be that people considered hoarding a subtype of OCD. There are certain kinds of OCD that lead to what looks like hoarding behaviors. Just a brief example. Someone who has a contamination obsession and can't touch anything unless it's thoroughly cleaned. Often what happens with those folks is that their cleaning compulsions get so complex and so time-consuming that they can't keep up with them. And what happens is their home fills up with things they consider to be contaminated, and they can't touch them. And often those things are things they don't really want or need, but they can't get rid of them because they can't touch them because they're contaminated. You'll notice that in the diagnostic criteria, nothing was said about excessive levels of acquisition. And that's because there appear to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 15% of these cases where people don't acquire excessively. They simply let things fill up. If you didn't ever throw away any of those envelopes from city cards asking you to sign up for a new credit card, how long would it take for your house to fill up? With every diagnosis, you have to specify whether it is with excessive acquisition or not. And the types of excessive acquisition are primarily buying extra or picking up free things, sometimes dumpster diving. The other specifier is whether or not the person has good or fair insight, poor insight, or is absent insight. Now, for those of you working in housing, if you have run into hoarding problems, it probably appears to you as though these people got no insight. In truth, it looks like most people with hoarding disorder do have pretty good insight. And whether or not you can detect it depends on the context of the discussion you're having with them. If you are perceived as an authority figure, they're less likely to admit there's a problem. But good or fair insight, the person recognizes that the hoarding-related beliefs and behaviors are problematic. Poor insight, they're mostly convinced that these beliefs and behaviors are not problematic, despite evidence to the contrary. And absent insight or delusional, they're completely convinced that the hoarding beliefs and behaviors are not problematic, despite evidence to the contrary. Now, the data so far suggests that this characterizes fewer than 5% of people with hoarding disorder. So it's, even though it depends, again, as I said, on the context of the discussion about it. When we assess hoarding behavior, the first thing we look at is we start by trying to assess risk. And the first risk is for fire. If you think back to Irene's kitchen, what you saw there was a table full of stuff, a counter full of stuff. The counter beside the stove, the oven top, was filled with papers. So you have a fire source next to a fuel source, and that is a big concern, especially in a home where you can't get out very easily. There's a recent study. I was in Melbourne, Australia, a year or so ago, and visited the fire brigade in Melbourne. They just completed a 10-year study looking at hoarding behaviors in relation to their residential house fires. And what they found was that they were relatively infrequent. Less than 0.25% of all the residential house fires in the state of Victoria in Australia involved hoarding. But those hoarding fires accounted for 24% of the fire-related deaths. So they don't happen very often, but when they do happen, they're deadly. And they're expensive, much more expensive than other residential house fires. We also look at the condition of the home. We look at level of squalor to get a sense of whether health and hygiene are impacted here. We don't know too much about the variables that drive people to live in squalid conditions. There certainly are people who live in squalor who don't have hoarding, but a number of people with hoarding problems live in squalor, sometimes because they can't really clean very easily. We look for structural damage, particularly damage that is going to increase over time, problems with roofs and so forth. So we look for that. And then we look for activities of daily living that are compromised because of the hoarding, such as preparing food, using the toilet, using the bathtub, and so forth. You'll be surprised by how many of these folks have learned to live without appliances of one sort or another. Now, the way that comes about, it seems pretty clear to us, that the home fills up, the person, their refrigerator breaks, they will not allow anyone into the home to fix the refrigerator because they're afraid of what those people will say about them if they saw the condition of the home. So they simply learn to live without the refrigerator. It's not that they want to live without the refrigerator, but because it will threaten their sense of esteem to have someone into the house, that they learn to live without it. We also have a couple of other ways of assessing it. The hoarding rating scale interview, 5 questions, semi-structured interview. The saving inventory is a self-report device, and the clutter image rating I'll talk about in just a second. If you're interested in these things, they are available on the International OCD Foundation website. There's a hoarding center there, it's at ocfoundation.org if you're interested in finding that. There's a lot of other information there as well. The clutter image rating is a series of 9 pictures. And we decided we had to do this because I got a call from a local psychiatrist a few years back, and he told me he had the worst hoarding case he'd ever seen, and that he thought this fellow would be a good candidate for some of my research and was willing to be involved. So he said, I'll set up an appointment for you. So we set up an appointment. I went out with one of my students to his house. We walked in the door, and the place was clean. There was a little bit of clutter in one corner, a little bit of stuff piled on the table, but the rest of it was clean, and I was shocked. I said, well, boy, you must have done a lot of work the last week since we talked on the phone. And he said, no, this is as bad as it gets. This is probably the worst case you've ever seen. It's so bad, in fact, that's why my wife left me. And so it didn't take too long to make it clear to us that that's not the reason his wife left. But he needed some way of explaining why she left. But it pointed out a difficulty we had, and that is differing interpretations of the word clutter. In his view, his home was totally cluttered. But in our view, the clutter amounted to next to nothing. And so we were interested in trying to find a different way of doing it. So I posed this problem to my seminar. I teach an undergraduate seminar, senior seminar on hoarding. And I posed this problem to them. And so we decided we would try to create some kind of pictorial scale to use when assessing hoarding. So there were all kinds of problems with it. The first problem is we had to find an apartment. We had to rent an apartment. So I went to the provost and I said, I want to rent an apartment with my students. Well, Smith is all women. And so the provost wasn't real happy with that. But she finally got over that. We rented the apartment. Then we had to fill it with stuff. It was unfurnished. So after the seminar one night, the seminar got over at 9, we took the furniture out of the psychology lounge. And we brought it over and put it in this apartment. So we got it all set up. It was about midnight when I got home. And I got a call from campus security. And they said, we had a report that your students stole the furniture out of the psychology lounge. And I thought that was funny. I said, no, that was me. That wasn't them. He didn't have that sense of humor. So he told me if I didn't come back and bring it back right that minute, he was going to arrest me. So the nice thing about teaching at a small college is you know everybody. So I happen to know the facilities manager who oversees the police, the campus security. So I called him at 1 in the morning, woke him up, told him my story. Luckily, he had a sense of humor, and I didn't get arrested. It turns out this is not an easy thing to do. So the students found all kinds of stuff in their dorm rooms and everywhere else, and we filled this. But it's so hard to find all this stuff that we got empty cardboard boxes, and we put them underneath there. And our idea was to reduce it, but try to keep the top looking kind of the same. Well, it's not easy to do that. The only way we could do it was to bury a student in there. We take a picture, and the student popped up and threw out the boxes from underneath, ducked down, and we took another picture. We get a lot of international students at Smith, and it just so happened that the student we buried was from Saudi Arabia, and she was the granddaughter of the king of Saudi Arabia. So we buried the Saudi Arabian princess in junk in the middle of Massachusetts. I don't know what the king thought of that, but
don't tell him.